Aos trabalhos desta conferência, vamos iniciar com a parte 2, que se debruçará agora sobre o assunto para onde queremos ou podemos ir. Então, nesta segunda parte, teremos também 3 intervenções, como disse no início, seguidas de um painel de debate que será moderado pelo Dr. Valdemar Duarte, membro da direção da APFIPP e também presidente da Comissão Consultiva de Fundos de Pensões desta Associação. Pede-se que se dirija ao palco para integrar um dos lugares do referido painel, por favor. Dr. Valdemar, já está aí. Muito obrigado. E para a primeira intervenção desta segunda parte, chama-se ao palco a professora Lourdes Afonso, presidente do Instituto dos Atuários Portugueses, cuja apresentação se intitula Feito o diagnóstico, que soluções ponderar? Tem a palavra. Muito obrigado.
Muito boa tarde a todos. Quero agradecer o convite endereçado pela APFIPP para o Instituto de Atuários Portugueses para podermos participar nesta conversa que tanta importância tem na nossa sociedade. Cumprimentar o Dr. João Prates e cumprimentar os meus colegas de painel e o resto da audiência. I'm going to switch to English. Now let's talk about some solutions. I'm going to present several. You already know some of them. The social security pension schemes are long-term societal commitments. You know that they must be honored by future generations, and these future burners, we need to access them, to know them, to measure them. The models combine social, economical, demographical, and actuarial knowledge. As you know, as you can see here, we have several variables, economic, demographic, social, and fiscal variables. All of them interact with each other. It's not a simple model, but we know how to work with it. The pay-as-you-go systems are subject to decisions made by politicians. We need periodical adjustments, demographic and economic uncertainty as the times we are living now. We saw the projections that occur because of demographical and economical changes. Usually these adjustments are made by legislation, and in some cases that legislation would not take into account the best long-term interest of pay-as-you-go contributors and beneficiaries. By definition, the pay-as-you-go systems are always funded. If you don't have money, you increase the contributions or you decrease the payments. Either of them usually are not accepted from the social point of view. We have in our law several principles. The main ones are equity and adequacy. Also the princípio de coesão intergeracional. As we know by now, this intergenerational support is not assured anymore in Portugal. We may start by increasing the contributions. We need to increase the number of actives. We need several generations in order to achieve some result in this area. Our fertility rates are very low. The migration of active people, the projections are for decreasing labor force. We can increase the taxes. We already talked about that. Our taxa social única is 34.75, of which 20% of the salary to old age pensions. The study that Jorge Bravo talked about it in June 2015, we projected for 2035 42% in order to keep the pay-as-you-go sustainable, and in 2055 46%. If we increase our taxes in this order, well, we are going to expect that our active population and employers will seek some other countries with lower taxes. We can decrease the payments. We are already doing that. We increase the normal retirement age. It's now a function of life expectancy. I'm not going to present any formulas here. In this 2022, it's 66 years plus 6 months. I've made some projections. They're slightly different from the aging report. 68 years by 2037 and 69 by 2052. We can decrease the amount of pension paid. We are already doing that. We change our formula of calculation. As Professor Jorge Bravo presented, we have here a limit in our IAS. We are considering all the contributory years and the salaries of that contributory years in that formula also. I have here a naive example. I considered the age pyramid in 2022, and I divide it from 15 to 65 and plus or equal 65. We have 64% of expected active people. They are not all of them, they are not actives, but they are expected active people, versus 24% of supposed retired people. If we look at these projections for 2040, if we consider the same interval age, we will have 56 versus 32. But if you consider the 70 years old, we have 64 and 24 here, and you have the same proportion as 2022. We have some advantages, mainly advantages in increasing the normal retirement age. We will increase the contributions and decrease the payments. That's the goal. But we should think about the health care. A prolonged working life might also have consequences for the health of individuals. I find 3 studies with different results. The first one focused on women born between 1950 and 1952 from Germany. And they provide evidence that the increase in the retirement age negatively affects health outcomes as the prevalence of several diagnoses, mental health, musculoskeletal diseases, obesity increases. A different study from Sweden that shows no evidence that the increase in retirement age impacted mortality or healthcare utilization. Another study from Spain indicates that the increase in mortality is stronger for those employed in low-skilled, physically and psychosocially demanding jobs. So they talk about a partial retirement is the suggestion that they give. There are recent studies, 2021 and 2022. In Portugal, I did not find any conclusive studies. Anna Veloso in 2015 states that active aging is important, and Mafalda Uva also in 2015 says that depends on the type of disease and group of data, it has a different impact. I think it's a good starting point to think about it. I suggest as a research for a thesis that we can think about what's happening in Portugal and the impact of the normal retirement age in the healthcare. Longevity expectations. We know that they are not uniform across the population, with possible variations across the socioeconomic spectrum. And it is also known that physically demanding jobs need to keep an early retirement age. We have that in our law. And how about the natural biologic limit to longevity? I found a study made in 2021 that says the natural biologic limit is between 120 and 150 years old. If you don't die of anything, your body will die between 120 and 115. Okay, 120, the oldest lady, registered oldest lady has 122. 150, it's a lot of years. Just does not consider that for the questions that we are talking today. But it's important to to understand the impact of future medical breakthroughs in our public health programs and also in pensions. If we increase the normal retirement age, I think there are a lot of people, and it's fine. It's very good indeed that they are still active at the age of 70 and they want to work. But in some cases, in the small business, and we have 96% of business that have less than 10 employees, if you have 1 or 2 employees that at age 70 is not able to be productive, what would you do with that person? So you are going to increase the expenditure with unemployment, healthcare, and other social assistance, because some people stop being able to work before they reach a higher retirement age. Well, decreasing the amount of pensions, we have already low pensions. Our average old pension is 487 euros. You can see here, okay, 69% of the pensions are lower than our índice de apoios sociais. Okay, next. If we decrease the amount of pensions that are being paid in that 69% of pensions, we are we may put the sistema previdencial in risk, and it's going to be useless to have a sistema previdencial if you are needing to go to sistema solidariedade to pick money from some subsidies to complete your pension and to have a minimal amount of money to survive. And this Proteção Social e Cidadania, the subsystems Solidariedade, is funded by the state budget, meaning more taxes. As we already talked about it, the conflicts between generations, we are moving from 1.5 to 3 people aged higher than 65 for each young person lower than 15 years old. Our labor force is expected to decrease. So we will have this conflict between generations that the last panel already talked about it. I think that our first pillar, our state pension, is going to secure a minimum standard of living. So we need to increase the second and the third pillar. The second pillar in order to maintain a current standard of living, and a third pillar for individual supplement. We need here some political courage to evaluate the social security sustainability, and I ask here, the model is disclosed and the assumptions are also disclosed, but the data, we need the data in order to other researchers to help and to have ideas and to try and to study and probably propose some solutions. It is important to define a reasonable replacement rate at normal retirement age, and not starting and ending at the normal retirement age, and to assess what are the expected future contributions and if they are enough to guarantee these expected payments. Should we implement notional defined contribution scheme? I'm going to leave that to Edward Parmel in next talk. We have here a study made in 2015. It's updated now, but it has a chapter applied to the Portuguese case. We need for sure to increase the literacy of the population. We need to explain in simple words what is the problem and what may be the solution, or what are the solutions that we are talking about. Are you going to increase the normal retirement age more or faster? Are we going to need to decrease the payments of pensions? Is there another alternatives? Which are the alternatives in a simple way for our population understand? It was easy to say that we need the productivity to increase to allow the third pillar. It's very nice there in the slide, but at the moment with low salaries, the third pillar has a marginal weight, as you can understand. Should we implement the savings by consumption? I wouldn't mind if I'm going to pay 99 cents for something to round it up, or 50 cents to round it up. It's probably easier for me just to do that when I'm going to pay for something than to remember at the end of the year to put some money aside in a pension fund. Probably it would be easy. This is my last slide, and I think it's the most important one. I think we must promote the second pillar to complement the state pension and the third pillar that now is in existence. And this would allow for our small, medium, and micro businesses to allow an early retirement agreements in order to renew talent and skills of the working force. The government taxes incentives should be to all companies, especially to micro, small, and medium-sized companies, to allow them to invest in the second pillar and allow them to prepare to a better complement of the state pension. Thank you so much.
Muito obrigada, professora Lourdes Afonso, por nos ter mostrado as opções possíveis para solucionar o problema que havíamos identificado na primeira parte desta conferência. Muito obrigado. Vamos agora ouvir Edward Palmer, professor emérito da Universidade de Uppsala, na Suécia, sobre algumas soluções já adotadas noutros países. Daí que a sua intervenção se intitule O caminho já percorrido noutros países, prova superada ou desafios em aberto? Professor Palmer, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, I hope you hear this. I want to thank the organization for inviting me for this opportunity. It's my second time. I've actually tried to explain the Swedish pensions scheme 15 years ago or so, and I don't think it made much of a difference. But it was a nice trip. Anyway, so I appreciate being here. And what do I do this then? I was pressing the green one. Okay, so I think I will say something about the old system. What I'm going to talk about is the new pension scheme, which is no longer so new, introduced in 1999, but it's still, in its own way, still relatively novel compared to many other alternatives. But to begin with, what we had when we then did this, introduced a new scheme, we After having done calculations, which we were required to do by law, and which I happened to just at that time in the 1980s, the mid-1980s, be in charge of doing, we found that by 2010, with any reasonable assumptions about the development of the population, et cetera, the system would be just, we would have to increasingly increase the contribution rate. And that was enough, I guess, to convince a lot of politicians on all sides of the bench. It took a while, and it took a lot of discussion, I should say, but because it turned out first we had the investigation of what it was going to look like in the future, and then that was depressing. And in order to do something about this depressing future, then the new government, which turned out to be to the center-right at that time, did something very clever. Instead of having a big committee representing all the interests of society, they said, well, now we've got 600 pages in print with all kinds of calculations of the sort that you've been looking at today. And so we don't have to have any more data. We just have to reform the pension system. And that became also a political matter, so that the Minister of Social Security or Social Insurance then initiated a committee that was comprised of representatives from all of the political parties, but also ones that he thought were persons who were capable of leaving their party biases and thinking about what's the best pension scheme for Sweden. And so these were party leaders from the right to the left also. In the end, the only party leader that of any relevance anyway, that did not approve of the pension reform was the party to the farthest to the left, who thought we should continue with the defined benefit scheme that we had and fix it. But okay, so we had an 80% vote in Parliament for a new pension scheme, and that's the scheme that I'm going to explain today. So what we then did was we introduced defined contributions. So we went from defined benefit for the whole system to defined contributions, and then splitting this up between what we heard today was called notional, but we now call it non-financial defined contribution, and then we have also financial defined contribution, which then otherwise is called, in the traditional literature, funded. But so we have this is emphasizing the point that it is defined contribution, and in one case, the rules are exactly the same between these two systems. Maybe I should say that first, so that in both systems, the NDC and the FDC schemes are based on individual accounts. So it's so simple that you have a contribution rate, which turns out to be 16% for the NDC scheme, and then 2.5% for the financial defined contribution scheme. And from the point of view of the participant, the same thing is happening. They're just, money is being, they don't even, if you think about it, do people in Portugal know how much the contributions are that they're paying to their pension scheme? No. Lots of people are shaking their heads no. And that's the way it is all over the world, of course. So people just don't know it. But with the individual account scheme, you can see it. And so you can turn on your computer and look and see, what does it look like for me? And of course, when we introduced the scheme, then we also introduced a do-it-yourself calculation program that anybody could use. And they could also download their own information to see what it looked like for them. And then, of course, we have this split between the NDC and the FDC scheme, but still. So if you're younger or older, you can figure it out, and particularly people around 55 or so start thinking very, very hard about this and how does it look. But this was actually, it made everything transparent. And I think that's important because for me, defined benefit is often not transparent, at least not for me as a participant. Defined contribution is, since I can look at my accounts, I can take a look at it. It's easy if I want to, if I'm that inclined to do a calculation of my own benefit in the future, under different assumptions. And so this was pretty obvious to everyone, including the politicians, that it is extremely transparent, which is very important. But in Sweden also, it's, I think, important for me to emphasize that the pension schemes are universal, the public pension scheme. But in addition to that, we have occupational schemes, and I will show you a pyramid in a couple of minutes. But as it turns out, the combination of the public scheme, which we have, which is mandatory, universal, and I should point out the politicians were. I want to give the politicians the credit. If you don't have politicians who are thinking positively, you're not going to get a pension reform, at least not a good one. So that the idea was to keep the government out of the pension system. And so now we have the NDC and the FTC schemes, the financial defined contribution or funded schemes, and the NDC schemes, which by law we've designed them so that you just follow the law, you do what the calculations are. There's even it was the first time a formula had been put into the Swedish law, but it's there. And it says what has to be done, which means that the politicians, of course, because they are there to make decisions, can change it, but they have to think about changing it twice, and it has to become you have to present that you're trying to do this, etc. So it was to get it out of the hands of the politicians, and that was, fortunately, the politicians who thought that it shouldn't be in their hands because it's too technical, generally speaking. Of course, the way I just described it, because it's not really so technical. Some money is deducted from the money that you otherwise would have been paid if it was with a salary or a wage, and it's sent into the pension scheme, gets registered on your account. At the end, you've got a large sum of money on your own personal account, and we use life expectancy to figure out how much you're going to get paid on a yearly basis. And of course, even the year at which you do life expectancy, from the year that you retire. So if you have a scope of retirement, you can make the decision to retire relatively early, but you can also see in these calculations, including by doing it just yourself, and compare it with, look, what happens if I work 2 or 3 years longer? If I, at least given at that time, then the pension ages, then the pension age was 65, but people could retire early and get a deduction at 61. But if you did that calculation, it didn't look very good because it makes it, the life expectancy factor is extremely important. And in addition, then you have a rate of return. And so that the accounts get the rate of return based on the growth of the economy, but not on GDP growth, but on the growth of the wage bill, which is underlying the pension system, because everything is, it's what people have paid from their salaries, even if it's only implicitly because there's an employer contribution, but I usually argue that the difference between, if I'm a normal worker and not a civil servant, the employer doesn't make a difference whether it's an employee or an employer contribution. It's being paid, and it has the same effect on the employer's position afterwards and mine. So it's really, and I've even found in the Netherlands a group of persons when we were discussing this, and the labor union said, yeah, well, this idea about it's an employer contribution is just not, it's not the way it works. And so even some unions understand that that's the way it works, is that you have a wage, and then you've got the extra part of your wage which is paid in terms of contributions into your pension scheme. Okay, the interesting thing perhaps about the FTC scheme is that, to begin with, since we're such a liberal country, we said almost all the funds in the country can become a part of it. So we had 700 pension funds that you could choose from. Everybody laughed at it. And this is the way it's been up until just very, very recently, which is this summer, the summer past, which I'll say something about in a second. But okay, there's a default fund also. And the majority of people, that is over 50% of the people, have chosen not to choose. So they're in the default fund. Turns out to be the best fund you can have if you look at the average of all of the market funds. It's not to say that the participants in the scheme have the average of all the market funds, but I'll show you in another slide that the average of the market funds is not a good choice to make. And so, but people could choose up to 5 funds, and so some people had five funds, and they got the average of whatever that was, calculated into their annuity. Okay, so that then you can claim the annuity, you can claim the benefit, which is the annuity, 25%, 50, 75, and 100, because that makes it possible to work part-time and have a part-time pension. And I think that's a good aspect of the pension system in Sweden. And we use unisex life expectancy, which I think, well, by law you're supposed to in the European Union, so I guess we don't have much choice. But I think that's what we would do anyway. It's an interesting question because we heard in previous discussion that we have we have 2 things happening. One is healthy life expectancy, and this is one solution, that you don't have to take all the pension at the same time to spread it out. And the other one of the things that I do want to mention is that there was maybe since it's because it's Sweden, but an emphasis on also equal rights between the sexes. And so this led then to a whole, Jorge had a slide which showed the various things that the government puts money into your account for, but he said in this country they don't put it into your account. But in Sweden they put the money into my account. So that was a part of this decision too, to finance these pension rights when they occurred. So when especially women who get special pension rights during the first 4 years after childbirth, they can choose between working a little, working a lot, or not working at all, and there's a minimum benefit for not working at all, and then there's a maximum benefit for some people who are high income earners. So to make it more or less reasonably equal. And that's, I think, one of the most, in terms of gender equality, one of the most important features. And before I go on to show you some data and things like that, I want to say that it's also important that we found in an academic study that I was associated with recently, that despite the fact that women have these benefits, they could stay home, they got paid, their pension contributions got paid, and then they can be at home also a certain amount of time taking care of with child care with the older children, and they get pension points and paid for by the same year that they're getting these through the government budget. So there's a lot done in this respect, but nevertheless, women in Sweden still work about 75% of the time of men. So we've got men and women working about a 41-year career on average, but the difference with the sort of system we've set up, where you get what you've paid for. And if you work 75% and your husband works, so you work the same job, you're a woman, you work 75% of the time because usually you're the one who's taking care of children even when they're 16 years old or whatever. At least somebody's there when they're coming home from school. Then, of course, 75% means that you get 75% of what you would have gotten if you were full-time. I think that's important, and I think there's also something simple to do about it, which is just to share pension rights. And so I've proposed that also in an academic, in a World Bank publication. But there is no discussion of that in Sweden, I should say. And I don't understand why, because that's a pretty obvious solution to this question, because you're sharing everything, income and care of children and care of the family, etc. It's something to think about, and maybe nobody's mentioned it, so maybe that's something you want to think about. The other thing is a joint annuity, which you can also create. So Sweden just has a simple, so to speak, annuity, but you could have a joint annuity. You can get it from the financial scheme in Sweden, but you cannot get it from the non-financial NDC scheme. And I think that you should be able to. But that's not a discussion point in Sweden. We have then a ceiling on earnings-based contributions, which is it's a little more than 1.5%, and I was a little lazy and didn't really check it. So I will then move on to the next slide, because I probably used all my time on my first slide. But in case there's more time left, this is then another picture. This is a picture of what it looks like. So we have this budget financed guarantee pension for those persons who do not get a pension, which have not worked enough and paid contributions enough to get a pension which is more or less above the poverty line. And that can be very many reasons, including in recent times we have 1 million immigrants who came in the past 10 years. And all the immigrants don't come when they're 21 years old and then work for 40 years. But a lot of them can be older. They can be 40-year-olds or whatever, and then they can only work half-time. Of course, that's just part of being a part of the Swedish system. So you might say, well, it's a shame they weren't born into it. But that's the way it works. So if you're... but the interesting thing then maybe is a couple of things I write on this slide is that after we had the reform of the public scheme, then the occupational schemes followed suit, which was extremely good for the whole system, because they were also, many of them, financial defined benefit schemes. And they even converted, as we had what you've been talking about, relatively slowly, because you can't make the conversion, we've heard it from a couple speakers, abruptly all at once, but you can make it, you phase one out and you phase the other in, and so that you make things work in general for both. And that's what we've done. So that's what happened even when we went from defined benefit to defined contribution to the NDC scheme. So it was a period of 20 years for this phasing in and phasing out, and we've passed that now. There are two other points which I think are, the first point, which is extremely important, is we had some really intelligent economists in the 1950s who managed to get the politicians to, because we had a baby, an extremely, like a lot of other countries had after the war, a baby boom at some point. Swedish baby boom started around 1944. Sweden wasn't in the war, so they didn't, but the baby boom around 45, like nearly after or after the war. And so you say about 5 or 6 years of baby boom babies. And this turned out to be a very good idea, because then the economists convinced the politicians that there should be a fund, a demographic fund, because all of these people were you could, like with the calculations you've seen presented here a couple of times today, it was easy to figure out that all of these babies, when they became pensioners, would create a problem, potentially. Okay, but I thought that was very intelligent. I was hardly around myself at that time, but it was with that sort of foresight. That foresight actually made everything in the Swedish reform very easy, because we because the government did not take money from the fund, which you might have thought that maybe many governments are tempted to do, until Sweden was going to enter the European Union and had to decrease its government budget. And at that point, they actually took some money from, they said there's way too much money in the fund, which our calculations more or less indicated also. And so we'll take a part of it and to pay off the government debt. So that's the only time it happened. And then because of that, we got into the European Union. We'll show you later if it's the government debt is now in Sweden 17% of GDP. So it hasn't been since that time, more or less, it hasn't been a big issue. It never has. So we just don't, another thing that we did, because there was a recession at that time, was to make a decision also between parties, right and left, that increasing the government debt was not a good idea. So that we have then this pension. I can mention one other thing, is that the occupational schemes also, of course, have been building up assets. And we have, in this pyramid, which you see in front of you, you have then $200 billion in the pension fund that I just talked about, that we've almost never used. We used it in 2008 2009, but otherwise we're using the returns on the fund. So the fund is not getting smaller, but it's not increasing either, because we're using those as the marginal payment because of this large population of persons born, baby boomers born in the late 1940s, early 1950s. So it's working exactly as anticipated, which it makes me kind of proud to say that, and that it was actually also important economists who then pushed this idea. But we also then now have in the public and FTC scheme, as I just mentioned, it's been building up, and so we've got $200 billion in the NDC scheme in a fund. We've got $200 billion in the FTC financial scheme, public one, as a fund. In addition, we have occupational funds, which I didn't have the energy to try to figure out how much those were, but I got another slide which will probably indicate what it is. This is just this is a simple picture to show you how the guarantee works. So the guarantee is means tested against the rest of your pension benefits. And that means that there's not a lot left actually to pay, because most people get a relatively good pension benefit. But then, having said this, we have now a different distribution of immigrants, and in this case, there are fewer women who are used to coming from countries where they're not expected to work. But I think that if it's a problem, it's a generational problem, and they will get a good guarantee pension, and then the rest of their family will just be a normal part of the Swedish population after that. So I think it's working out. There's not much more to say about the guarantee. It's tax financed, of course. It's not a contribution race. We have a solvency ratio, which is more or less something that a couple of the speakers have mentioned here also, but the Swedish system, then in the NDC scheme, we look at the ratio between estimated assets and liabilities. And if the assets turn out to be less than the liabilities, then we decrease the pensions. We decrease everything that is being indexed, which are both pensions and accounts of workers. So that's important to say. And this happened actually in 2008 or 9, and somebody will say, well, people couldn't have liked that. And that's right. They didn't. But it still nevertheless survived, which I thought is sort of, because what happens when you do this is that unless you're going to be going downhill for the rest of the country's life, you don't really have a problem, because it's temporary if you're right there on the borderline of having to decrease ratio decreases, and you have to then follow the law. It's written into the law. And even the equation in the law looks a little more serious than this one. But you do it. But on the other hand, you know that the Swedish economy, like most European economies, will recover from this recessionary period of a few years. And then it's possible that the money gets actually put back into the system after this, up to what would have been the normal development given the rate of return on the pension funds. So that there's, in essence, then people didn't lose any money in the long run, but they lost some temporarily, and those who just had workers, didn't really think about it because it didn't make much difference. They lost some and then they got it back. But the pensioners also got back on the same track. But it creates discussion, and it's something, and I think that when you think about doing this, you have to think about not just saying, well, we'll do this calculation with an average of 3 or 4 years. You've got to think about this, what is realistic. You don't have to make it a fast change. And you also should make it so that you can go back and people can recover some of the loss, especially the pensioners. Okay, this is a mess, but these are then the total funds in Sweden, and if you look there, we've got funds which are 6,000 US. 6,006. We're into the billions here. Sorry. So that we've got billions, not thousand. Well, 6,000 billion, whatever that is. A lot of money and a lot of funds, and most of those funds, 75% of those funds are the public pension funds, but the financial defined contribution public pension funds, actually all of the money is being managed by private funds. So that the people choose private funds unless they choose a default fund, but the default fund also is just a group of private funds, but it's the ones that have been chosen by the experts in the pension agency, and so it's not any fund, and it turns out that decision was pretty good too. But talking about funds, then we have Sweden in the fund ranking, I guess, and probably to no one's surprise, the Netherlands is on top because they have a relatively strong funded component of their total system. And then we have Iceland, which maybe nobody here knows much about, but they're up there too, and then Switzerland. The United States has the 401k, but I would say that that's the only good news I can say about the 401k, so I have to then have a parenthesis and say not something that is not so good about the 401k, and that's when I started out this talk by saying that the system should be universal and mandatory. Okay, the 401k it's anybody can get into it more or less, and it's not mandatory. And so somebody who then, there's a very good pension economist in the US who is the one who does a lot of the academic work with the US pension system. And the 401k is then, if you had been a full-time participant in the 401k from the time at which it was introduced, that is during 40 years, then you would have had pension assets that were $500,000 US when you retired at the age of 60. That's pretty good, but then you still, from the age of 60, you've got a lot of retirement years, and so you divide that up into all of the years that you're retired, but it was still pretty good. So what's happened to people in practice? That was the theoretical result if everybody then really participated. The actual result is that people have on average 100,000, and that is of course not a lot. And the reason why they have 100,000 is because people are allowed to go in and out and do all kinds of things and make their own decisions. And their decisions might even be to just cash in early. But the main problem, I think, is that if you really are serious about this, then I think it has to be mandatory. Otherwise, it's going to look like what I just described about the 401k. And then I have some other evidence, which is the continent of Latin America, or after the Chilean system, which required that your employer was a part of the scheme. So in order to become a part in the Chilean financial pension scheme, you had to have an employer. Well, most people even today in Latin America don't have an employer, and so they don't have they weren't getting a Chilean pension, and even the Chileans had to reintroduce actually a guarantee pension for a large majority of the population, because this wasn't mandatory. There was nobody trying to recruit the persons who did not have employers, because by law you had to have it, the employer had to be a part of it, which is not a good idea. As we all know, employers come and go too. You've got then Chile now has 70% of the retiring population who have a pension from the financial scheme. That's why they had to also develop a guarantee pension starting about 10 or 15 years ago. But then the same thing is true of the rest of Latin America, because actually Chile and Uruguay are the two best countries, and then thereafter Brazil. But most of the countries in Latin America, by doing this sort of a thing, have letting people make the decisions themselves instead of mandating it. So I'm arguing in favor of that. They end up with having something like 20 to 40% of the working age population involved in pension schemes. And that's not enough, you would say. So that's something to think about. But anyway, we've got Sweden on place number 7. Maybe we'll move up to 6 or 5. Who knows? It looks like it probably will happen. So then, what do we have here? We have the default fund, which is called it's called SOFA in Swedish, but it's also the same word as sofa, the thing that you lie on when you're at home watching the football match. And it's interesting to see that the persons who are administering this managed to get a return over 20 years, the 20 years which it has existed, of 362.9%, which is pretty good. And then if you look at the other pension funds, this is the public scheme, the average of their average is over there, which I can look here, I guess, it's 165%. That doesn't mean that the private sector is poor, but on the other hand, having all of these 700 funds is maybe not worth the time, and maybe it should be smaller, and that's what the country of Sweden is thinking about now and starting to introduce. So the whole scheme is being redone. The default scheme will be the same, but the rest of the choice part of this will then be different. Okay, so here's what happened then during the current year while we're sitting here. So if you look at the blue ones, those are the public pension funds, and the AP7 SOFA, which is then spending your time in the sofa watching the football game while somebody else chooses your funds. Turns out not to be so bad, because they only lost 12% to date. Whereas if you look at one of the more aggressive funds, AMF Aktiefond Sverige, they've lost it's here, 36%, and a lot of funds lost 30%. And that's the average. The average for Swedish stock market was minus 33%. But the point of this is to show you that if you've got a good system going, thinking about how the fund should be designed, and which is what Sweden has been thinking about all the time, and it's been revised a couple of times, so that the question is maybe you shouldn't have these very aggressive funds. You might have more, you will have more aggressive funds for 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds, and then somewhere there you start making them less and less and less aggressive. And in the Swedish system, I can have my funds left as a pensioner, and then I should probably not have them all in at this level where the AMF AXI fund went down by 36%, and that the normal crash in the normal fund in the market went down by 33%. But the whole point is that it doesn't have to be a minus 33. In one of these big minus periods like this present year, then of course a more goal-oriented fund can then come up like the AP SOFA with only having lost 12% during this year, which is, I mean, that's kind of what happened in the 2008, 2009. And as I said earlier, funds recovered from that rather quickly. So that's that. I probably have a couple of other things to say. Just in case you're wondering how many people are in Sweden, it's 10.5 million. Public debt, I said 15%, and I'd forgotten, it's 19.2% of GDP, but that's pretty good after the pandemic times, etc. Tax burden is high, so you might not want to go to Sweden anyway because you've got to pay a lot in taxes, but then you get your health care paid for and a few little trivial things like that. So if you're in the United States, for example, then you pay 18% of your 18% of your salary or wage to provide for your health care. So if you those are the two extremes. In GDP per capita, it's ranked number 9, the 9th ranking, and we're getting actually with all of these immigrants that came, a lot of people who came without jobs, of course. But most of them have found their way into the labor market, which was good. So that even though we've got in Sweden a fertility rate of, on average, actually it's been this way for many, many decades, about 1.7 to 2.0, that is to say, sometimes we're almost replacing the whole population with new babies. We also have high immigration, which means that the labor force is increasing all the time. And so that's, I mean, that's, and when I was listening to the presentation of Portugal, then of course that's not a bad idea to have a labor force, as long as you have demand for labor, which somehow Sweden does. I mean, there's a lot of industry in Sweden, which it's not a tourist country in general. It's too cold and has too many polar bears, but especially if you go too far north, you have to be careful. Anyway, the Gini coefficient is 0.276, which is relatively low, but it's about where most of Northern Europe is. Portugal, I looked up, is 0.31. That's pretty good. Certainly much better than the United Kingdom or the United States if you're interested in equality. But, okay, the last thing I'll say is that the public financial defined contribution scheme is in the process of changing. It's not, the 700 funds have already been decreased to 475. A lot of funds had really almost no participants, and a lot of funds in foreign countries, you had to be registered to work in the fund market in Sweden. And there were a lot that there's no reason why they should be there actually. And so, but it's a gradual thing, so that there's a phasing out, and the persons who actually have the funds that are phased out then have some sort of information from the administration telling them it's time you have to change funds, because the funds that you have are no longer going to be included in the system. And then they're continuing with this, and they're going to develop it so that people have something like better information about how to make decisions. And I'm not quite sure whether that's going to be a big success or not, but it's going to be tried. And at this point, I'm finished.
Thank you so much, Professor Palmer, for your insightful intervention and for your thoughts about these issues. They will be very important for the debate. Vamos rapidamente passar para a terceira intervenção desta segunda parte, com Jerry Moriarty, CEO da Associação Irlandesa de Fundos de Pensões, administrador da Pension Europe e membro do Occupational Pension Stakeholder Group, da Autoridade Europeia dos Seguros e Pensões Complementares de Reforma, fará uma intervenção sobre o novo enquadramento que está a ser ponderado para a Irlanda. O seu título é Auto-Enrollment, Casos Concretos, uma solução de sucesso? É esta a questão. Mr. Moriarty, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. I'm a frequent visitor to Portugal, but unfortunately, well, shamefully, I've never learned the language, so thank you for listening in English. I'm going to talk about auto-enrollment, look at the existing cases, and talk about whether it's a successful solution. The existing case, particularly, is the UK. Going to touch a little bit on Ireland, where our plan is to introduce auto-enrollment in just over 12 months' time, and also look at some work and recommendations done by the European Commission in the last year. I guess just to start off, just to explain what auto-enrollment is, and particularly in the Irish and UK context. In Ireland, we have a first pillar pay-as-you-go system, which provides our state pension. But the role of that is different to what I've been learning today about Portugal, in that the real purpose of that pension is to keep people out of poverty. It provides about a 35% of average salary replacement rate, and it's also a universal pension in that everybody gets the same amount. So there's a lot of redistribution. People who are wealthy pay quite a lot of social insurance contributions, and a lot of those go to paying pensions of people who are less wealthy. We rely on second pillar pensions, which are occupational pensions, to provide a gap and are a way of giving people the opportunity to achieve a replacement rate in retirement. But the problem with that is a voluntary system, so only about 50% of the workforce are covered by occupational pensions, and it was a very similar situation in the UK before auto-enrollment. What auto-enrollment does is people who are not in an employer pension scheme are automatically put into one, and they generally have the option to opt out. It relies a lot on behavioural economics, on nudge theory, where you can, if you like, almost force people to make choices that are to their benefit. And it has been successful in doing that. Our occupational pensions in Ireland are about 120 billion, which is why we appeared on the table, which is quite a good starting point. But again, if you're in the 50% of the workforce who doesn't work for an employer who has a pension, then you've got a problem with retirement when you're going to struggle to have the type of retirement that most people would like to have. The UK, it's quite timely to look at it. UK introduced auto-enrollment 10 years ago last month. So there's some really good learnings from that. We're looking at some of those in Ireland. We've made some changes to how it works in the UK. Just the basic system in the UK, if you're over age 22, if you're earning more than £10,000 a year and you're working for an employer who did not have a pension scheme in place, then your employer has to put you in one anyway. Currently, employee contributions are 5% of salary. The employer pays 3% of salary. As I said, the employer chooses the provider, but there is also a provider of last resort, which is Nest, and it's worth looking at Nest particularly. So Nest was set up by the UK government. It was set up because a lot of people who are being auto-enrolled are on low earnings. Their contributions are going to be low, and a lot of commercial pension providers do not want that type of business because it's difficult to make money on it. Nest cannot refuse any business, so there is somewhere for everybody to go to. It's actually been incredibly successful, not just as an operator of last resort, but actually chosen by a lot of people to be the provider. It's currently got 11 million members. It's got £24 billion in assets. It's got £477 million in contributions coming in. And I saw the CIO of Nest speak recently, and one of the biggest problems he has is finding places to invest that money. Nest were also, and again, because behavioural economics are quite a part of this, if you like, the UK auto-enrollment system is described as one of the biggest social experiments ever taken by a government. Nest had a simple investment strategy where they're very keen that at the beginning people just would not lose money, because if you're being brought into something that's not your choice, if you had a bad experience, then that could turn people against it. They've actually been very successful and have a very good investment record. I think since inception they've been returning about 12% per annum, and that's on a very conservative investment strategy. And they're starting to to do a lot more things like investing in liquid assets that their size allows them to do. In Ireland, we have been considering auto-enrolment for a long time. Some of the issues we spoke about earlier about, lack of political will has been a big issue, but we now seem to be moving closer to actually getting it in place. The plan is that the first people will be auto-enrolled at the beginning of 2024. I still think that's a little bit ambitious in terms of the things that need to be done, but I think there is a clear will to make sure that something does happen. We're going to auto-enroll people who are aged over 23 and under age 60, earn more than €20,000 per annum, and contributions ultimately are going to be 6% for employees, 6% for employer, and a 2% direct contribution from the state. Those contribution rates won't come in on day one, because obviously that would be quite a big shock to both the economy and to people. So they will be phased in over 10 years. In year one, it will be 1.5% employee, 1.5% employer, 0.5% from the state. Then in year 4, it goes to 3%, 3% and 1, and then in year 7 and year 10, ultimately getting up to the 6, 6 and 2. Different to the UK, it won't be the employer who chooses the fund, it will be the employee. The rationale for that is that in the UK, once people change employers, they often end up with a different pension provider, so they end up with lots of different small pension pots. That can be difficult to put together. People forget where they have those, so in Ireland it's going to be employee chooses the fund. Therefore, every time an employee changes job, they just stay within the existing fund. That's all going to be managed by a central processing agency, which will be set up. The central processing agency will basically have the job of ensuring people get enrolled, choosing investment managers. So it's intended that there will be 4 investment managers chosen. They will manage all the funds. That will be done by tender process. They will each be required to have a default fund for those people who either don't want to make a decision or feel they're not able to make a decision. They will have a higher risk fund, a medium risk fund, and a lower risk fund, and there will be the choices available to people. The individual employee will choose the type of fund they want to go in. Clearly, if they don't make a choice, they end up in the default fund, and interestingly, in Nest, 99% of their members are in the default fund. Where the employee chooses a fund, so for example, if they choose default or end up in default, or if they choose a high risk fund, their contributions will then be split across the 4 different fund managers, and that's to ensure that the returns effectively get smoothed between the different managers, so that you don't have 2 employees working in one company and one got really lucky by choosing a successful manager one year and the others were less lucky. So that's obviously with auto-enrolment there's an option to opt out. So in the Irish case, you will have to stay in the fund for at least 6 months. You'll have the opportunity to opt out in month 7 or 8, or at any stage where the contributions increase. If you opt out, you get your contributions back, but the contributions made by the state and by your employer stay in the fund, so you'll still have something for retirement. And again, using behavioural economic theory, the idea is that if people are in the fund for 6 months, they're more likely to stay in than to opt out. Experience in the UK where they had thought that up to 30% of people would opt out. In fact, only 10% of people have opted out. So a lot of the time, a lot of people are enrolled. They know they probably should be planning to do something for retirement, but it's really helpful when someone else does it for them and they just stay in. And interestingly enough, in the UK as well, I think 35% of people who are in a pension fund don't even know they're in it. It's just money comes out of their salary. They don't really know what's happening, but ultimately it's for their good, so that's probably not a bad thing. In terms of sort of issues around it, auto-enrolment is clearly very successful in increasing pensions coverage. Coverage in the UK has gone from pre-auto-enrolment 48% of the working population to now being 80% of the working population. Where you tend to get gaps are people who've opted out. Self-employed generally don't tend to be in auto-enrolment schemes, although that's something the UK is looking at. It's something we're looking at in Ireland as a kind of second-order issue. Obviously, how successful they are in adequacy is very much dependent on the contribution levels that go in. If you look at the numbers on Nest, which are incredibly impressive, 11 million people, 24 billion in assets, that does mean that people have roughly about £2,000 in their accounts. So the contribution rates at the UK are now 8% in total, and it's 8% on a band of earnings, and it wasn't from the beginning, so it started very low. We've made a conscious decision in Ireland to have 14% in total, which we feel gets more people to an adequate pension. Who to include is also important. In the Irish case, we're starting at age 23. Most Irish people go on to third level education, so most people join the workforce around that age. As an association, we feel it's much better to just start people when they start employment, particularly a lot of people who end up starting employment at a younger age tend to be in manual labour, have a lot more job changes, so it's more important to get them in, we feel. And also we think that people adjust their spending and budgeting to their first pay packet, whereas actually taking money out of people who might have been working for some time might make them more likely to opt out. Ensuring continuity is also important. That's why we are focusing on enrolling employees so that they continue to stay with the same provider and you don't have lots of different pension pots. I think in the UK at the moment they've got, even though they've got about 12 million extra people saving for retirement, they've got 22 million different pension accounts. So already you've got lots of small multiple accounts. How to pay the benefits is also incredibly important. It often tends not to be thought about enough in getting it started, and that's something we're doing in Ireland as well. The idea initially is that a lot of the benefits initially would be paid out in a tax-free cash format because they're going to be very small, but that doesn't really help solve the issues around retirement, so that's something we think needs a lot more thought. In terms of the European Commission, they issued a paper a year ago. They have a lot of really good recommendations in it. I've just picked out some of the important ones, and I think some of these are really key to judging whether auto-enrolment is a successful solution or not. I think the really first important thing is defining what your policy goal is. All of the discussion we've had here today is very similar to discussion we're having in Ireland, discussion that's happening in a lot of other particularly developed economies. The starting points are different in terms of when longevity becomes a really big issue, when you get that really big change from the number of workers to the number of retirees. And obviously, the type of system you currently have is obviously really important in starting out in terms of what you want to achieve. Clearly, in Ireland and the UK, the focus is on increasing coverage, making sure more people have adequate pensions when you have a state pension that really just keeps you out of poverty. Achieving consensus has been touched on already. That's also hugely important. Political consensus is important. It really needs somebody to drive it through politically, but also consensus between employer and employee representatives, so trade unions, businesses, and also getting people who are being enrolled to understand that this is happening and this is good for them. Phased introduction, obviously, there's been a lot of economic analysis done on the impact of auto-enrolment in Ireland. It will have a negative impact in the economy for quite some time. That obviously then switches around to being positive as more money starts being paid out and people have better retirements. Having mandatory access, so making it available to everyone. Even though, for example, we're planning on only enrolling people over 23, people under that age can volunteer to opt in and their employers will have to pay for them. And re-enrollment as well. So if people do opt out, they get re-enrolled 2 years. And eventually, the idea is they just get sick of being re-enrolled and stay in and stop opting out, unless they have really good reasons to opt out. Having a low-cost provider via the state, I think in the UK that's been proven to be very successful. Not only as having something available for people who may not be able to find a commercial provider, but that state provider can also set standards, standards around charges, for example. In the UK, the maximum charge is 0.75% of the assets. In Ireland, it's planned to be 0.5%. Whether that's realistic in terms of the cost of setting up the central processing agency and just being a smaller country, we'll have to wait and see. Obviously, having a default fund, 99% of people in Nest end up in the default fund, so that's a good thing to have. Generally, those have life cycle strategies where you're reducing risk as people approach retirement, depending on what your retirement options are. Good governance and transparency. Nest operates as an occupational pension scheme, is regulated by the pensions regulator in the UK. The Irish scheme, the Central Processing Agency, will be an IRP. It will be subject to IRP2 regulation and regulation by the regulator. And designing the transition to decumulation, which I've touched on already, is also quite important. That's a really quick overview of auto-enrolment in Ireland and the UK. Quite happy to talk a bit more in the panel. So, obrigada.
Thank you, Mr. Moriarty, for your interesting intervention and for your vision of the auto-enrollment system. Vamos concluir esta segunda parte da conferência com o painel de discussão. Tenho o prazer também de chamar ao painel o Sr. Mário Pires, Head Institutional Portuguese Market Manager da Schroders Investment Management, que se dirige então também, já lá está, muito obrigado. Vamos dar então início a esta conferência, este painel ligado, digamos assim, onde o tema é o que nos espera, que soluções para Portugal, moderado por o Dr. Valdemar Duarte, que tem a palavra. Muito obrigado.
Okay, I had 5 questions for each, but I'm going to do it briefly with just one question for each of the members. And Mario, you were not in the panel, so you have the privilege to be the first. Now we are facing a moment with a strong financial crisis, both with the equity market and bond markets going down, with returns that are relatively low. And these moments normally lead guys that are opinion makers and some politicians to say that long-term savings, they are very good. They increase results in the normal times, and then a crisis comes and takes it all, and even the capital stays in risk. So my question is, you are coming from an investment house with long-time history, and to tell us what is your experience on that. Does risk reward or not? And then a small word about what are you thinking to be your role in terms of the PEP, the Pan-European Pension Product?
Thank you very much, Valdemar. Good afternoon, everyone. Market corrections happen in the market. This is not new. If we look back for the last 30 years, we had the big major events. We have 2 Gulf Wars. We had the dot-com boom and bust crisis. We had the global financial crisis, and lately the European crisis. And if you look at the markets, look at, let's say, the US market, the S&P is off the highs, 17%, the Nasdaq 28%, 29%. So what this means is really, what is important is really to look at the long term. We can't let these market corrections keep us away from our long-term objectives. So in our opinion, it's all about also financial literacy. People have to understand that when you look at the long term, and if you look, for instance, one of the measures we can look at our rolling returns, and when we speak about pension money, rolling returns 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, then the returns are positive. No matter what asset class you look for, from the most conservative ones to the more aggressive ones, equities, they provide a positive return. So we have to look is really, when we talk about pension money, this money has to be patient, the capital has to be patient, and we cannot be put away from our track just because we have a correction. And if we look behind the 4 big crises that I mentioned, if it was the case, the market was not at the point it is. So we have to really give a step back and think this is pension money. So we have to have the time to work for us. We cannot just say that the 3 years, 4 years lack of returns or corrections will make us change our strategy. So at Schroders, we really think that a long-term view is very much important.
And PEP?
The PEP, I think, is really a very interesting initiative. The only problem is, here in Portugal, the 3rd pillar is really a very small portion. And of course,
I think we might have some surprises.
Hopefully.
incentivations and things like that. But
I think
we never know.
That will
We never know.
because what I really find interesting, and for myself, having worked in different countries, I have small pensions scattered in different countries, small amounts of probably I will never collect. The PEP would allow really for me to have one pension if I decide to go from, actually I live in Spain, come to Portugal and bring my pension to Portugal. I think that's a fantastic initiative. But the thing is, the pot needs to be
Needs
bigger.
to be big.
Indeed.
Okay, message. Okay, Professor Lourdes Afonso, I'm going to be fast, sorry. I have in one question in two. So the first part of the question is, normally the huge defenders of the pay-as-you-go system, they already recognize and balance in the future, but they say, okay, let's increase the taxes, and there are always ideas to put taxes on the companies, mainly on capital intensives. And my question there is that possible and is that desirable? And I have another question. We have some studies, and we saw some studies, so there are studies, but the complaint we hear is that normally we don't have available data from Social Security, public available data. And my question is that a question of data protection? Is the question. And if not, what are the data that are needed to do a deep dive and to build up a patient dashboard effective to be controlled over time in Portugal?
Thank you. First of all, I think we have already, our taxation is already high. So I think it's best if we try to transfer some of that taxes to the second pillar in order to have complement to the state pension and some fiscal incentives to the small companies to have pension funds. We need also to invest in 21st century pension schemes, not only hoping to not have the problems of not being solvent between 35 and 2050, but only thinking, also thinking about the future generations for the remain of the century. So I don't think that increasing taxes should be a solution. The data. Well, if you give data to an actuary, you will be very happy and wonderful things would happen.
We have several here.
Yes. The concern is the data that we need. We need the data for the pensions and for the salaries and the contributions by gender and by age. If you move far to the end of the table, say 100 years, 101, you may have only one pensioner or two, and then you may
know who is the guy.
Yes, but apart from that, if you just aggregate all the data above 100 years or so, all the data that you need, you may work with an aggregate information, and you may have a databases, and you may work with database and have some research doing with that.
So it's possible and easy?
I think so.
Okay, just a question of will. So, Jerry, one question for you. In Portugal, we have an industry of pension funds that is mainly a legacy industry, defined benefit. But we have industry in place, and we have asset managers. We have a very good law fine-tuned with Europe too, and we have a sound and effective regulation and supervision. So imagine that our government decides to begin to implement an auto-enrollment scheme. So what would be your advice to begin and the pace of implementation?
I think the recommendations from the European Commission are quite a good place to start. They're very sensible. There's a lot of good stuff there. I think understanding what your policy goal is really important. I think on the pace of implementation, I don't think Ireland is a great example because we've been considering this issue for about 20 years with a lot of reports, a lot of analysis. I think you need to have a strong political will to make it happen. And then the pace of implementation can be quite quick. We were talking last night, and I think I suggested 3 years to 5 years maybe as being realistic. That depends on how much infrastructure you're going to build that's new. So in Ireland, the Central Processing Agency or Authority is going to be a new infrastructure. In the UK, they use a lot of existing infrastructure. Nest was new. But it's more about getting that initial decision that we want this to happen, we know what we're trying to achieve, and then just moving forward with it quickly.
Thank you. Fantastic. And for Professor Palmer, I have a $1 million question. So it's a small question, but it's $1 million question. You told us that the secret in Sweden was a consensus among politicians. Only 80%, 80, not 18, okay? So only 18% was within the process in the beginning, and they kept.
They were all there from the beginning. And 80%, that's 80% of Parliament.
Yes, politicians in Parliament.
Yeah.
What was really the secret to put all that people that don't think the same way, fine-tune and studying and working to build up a solution?
Well, the secret is just putting them together and letting them work together.
You close them in the room?
They, more or less. Well,
like to select the Pope.
actually, that's pretty close to the truth. So more or less, it was because we had this group. The group was small. So one expert, one person that always has to be from the Ministry of Finance, and then politicians, and then a couple of lawyers to write the law, and that was it.
So easy.
And we had, well then of course, I was the one who was in charge of all the calculations, and I had a team of about 7 persons who helped produce all the calculations. We had something like 80 proposals that we did calculations for just for the guarantee benefit. You'd think that was the least important in a sense, but that's the way it was. And actually, the politicians had the discussion of pension funds, etc. That was actually a separate issue. So we had a separate group that worked on introducing the private pension industry in Sweden into the public pension system, and that was a separate effort. It's still at the same time, at the same time that everything else was happening, and so it was. And it required also votes in Parliament, and the same group of politicians, once they saw this product, they said, fine. Because that was what at least half of the politicians wanted to have more of from the beginning, because they were in the parties to the right, the parties to the left wanted to have more pay-as-you-go, the ones to the right wanted to have more financial money, and we had lots of scenarios like people have been presenting here. Different population, rates of growth of populations and participation and everything else. And so we had all the facts. And it turned out to be because this group actually decided to work for Sweden instead of for their own parties. And they were chosen that way. So that the minister who chose them chose persons that he knew were going to, they had enough knowledge of what was necessary to have knowledge of to have this discussion and interest, and put them together, and actually, the doors were quite closed, so nothing leaked out until everything leaked out at the same time.
Okay, so with the right people, with goodwill, it's possible.
It's possible.
It's very good. It's very good. Sorry, João, I'm going to at least open for one question for the audience. So, is there a volunteer For one question, for someone. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Okay.
I forgot to say, if you add together all of that pyramid, it produces a 65% more or less replacement rate for the average person, and this was calculated by the OECD, so that we're using their assumptions, which are relatively conservative.
Okay, so thank you all.
Thank you all for the speakers of this discussion panel, for sharing your expertise and knowledge with us. E então agora, para realizar um wrap-up do que foi falado esta tarde aqui, tenho o prazer de voltar a chamar aqui ao púlpito o Presidente da APFIPP, o Dr. João Pratas. Por favor, doutor, agradecia então a sua presença para fazer aqui o resumo desta conferência.
Bom, eu vou fazer aqui um wrap-up rápido da conferência. Well, the first question, I'll address my first remark in English, is we have a problem. And it's pretty obvious for everyone in the room that we do have a problem. It's basically, well, mainly because of the demographics, but it has to be solved. So I think we can decide that we will invite Edward Palmer, the 2 lawyers, the 7 people who were working with you, and you'll be here next week. Maybe we'll solve the problem. Well, anyways, em relação àquilo que ouvimos hoje, tivemos vários oradores a apresentar as suas posições, os seus entendimentos sobre vários aspectos. Francisco Franco começou por fazer uma análise sobre aquilo que é o Pay As You Go, a mudança para outro sistema e as implicações que isso pode ter em termos de custo, que é um ponto bastante relevante, porque se quem contribui para o Pay As You Go começa a desviar para outro tipo de capitalização, há de facto depois ali uma falha. Se a Suécia, no final dos anos 90, tinha um fundo com cerca do produto nacional português, que eram 200 mil milhões, eu julgo que nós não temos, e portanto haverá sempre um problema da forma como pode ser feito, nomeadamente faseado. A Associação Nunes explicou-nos o Aging Report, é um relatório muitíssimo importante, porque apresenta factos, que embora obviamente sejam projeções, permitem depois, no fundo, com base nessas projeções, ver como é que podemos resolver o problema. Nós temos um problema, porque se nós olharmos para o Aging Report, eu acho que há um ponto que é muito relevante, que é a evolução da dívida atual, portanto, no fundo do déficit, que é aquilo que é necessário para suportar as pensões, quer na Segurança Social, quer na Caixa Geral de Aposentações, um déficit que vai chegar a 14% do PIB. E 14% do PIB é um valor muito elevado. O Jorge Bravo também nos deu bastantes ideias. Uma das ideias que ele nos deu é, no fundo, mudar o sistema, em que o sistema passa a funcionar com base em critérios atuariais que possam, no fundo, ser razoáveis em termos das contribuições e em termos do compromisso de encargo que venhamos a ter mais tarde. Quanto mais depressa isto for implementado, provavelmente mais depressa nós chegamos a uma posição de equilíbrio. Para este efeito, ele pediu uma coisa que eu acho que várias pessoas pediram ao longo da conferência, que é a maior transparência possível nos dados. Achamos que, mesmo o Aging Report era importantíssimo que no fundo fosse público, que o público conhecesse os dados para poder discuti-los e poder ver se as projeções têm outras visões possíveis. Na nossa segunda parte, continuamos com questões atuariais, com questões que podem alterar a forma de ver o tema. O Luís Afonso, no fundo, explicou-nos que havia maneiras de fazer face ao problema de termos de diminuir os valores, nomeadamente aumentando a idade da reforma, mas também se salientou a importância do aspecto atuarial, no fundo, de termos uma razoabilidade entre as contribuições que temos e os encargos. O Edward Palmer falou-nos do modelo suíço. Achamos que é um modelo muito, muito importante, porque, no fundo, mais uma vez, parece permitir uma relação entre as contribuições que existem para um determinado sistema e os encargos que vamos a ter. Ele chamou a atenção para o ano 2009, em que as pensões diminuíram. E as pensões diminuíram porque, de facto, tem que haver esse matching entre as contribuições e os encargos. Tem que haver um equilíbrio, coisa que nós não temos. Nós temos um sistema de benefício definido, que é assente num determinado regime, que é a média das contribuições ao longo da vida, e que é um pouco cego em relação àquilo que poderão vir a ser as necessidades na altura em que a pessoa atinge a reforma. Finalmente, o Jerry Moriarty apresentou o sistema do auto-enrollment. O auto-enrollment tem a parte interessante de ser um regime supletivo, na medida em que a pessoa pode sair, mas ao mesmo tempo acaba por haver inércia, e no UK verifica-se que de facto há um aumento grande dos valores e, portanto, é um sistema que pode ser muito interessante. Agora, acima de tudo, aquilo que eu acho que nós temos que ponderar, em Portugal, para já, é ter um sistema equilibrado. É ponderar e pensar como é que nós vamos ter um sistema equilibrado. Se calhar não temos outro remédio, como dizia o Jorge Bravo, em arcar com o déficit todo que vamos ter durante largos anos, porque o sistema não está equilibrado, e possivelmente poderá ser muito importante pensar num sistema dual, em que há um sistema público que garante um determinado valor de adequação de pensão e depois um sistema alternativo já mais capitalizado, tipo auto-enrollment, que é feito a uma conta já mais baseada em valorizações de mercado dessas contas. Isto são ideias para pensar. Eu acho que temos um problema, acho que temos que o pensar, temos que falar sobre ele, discuti-lo, ser transparentes, e eu espero que tenha sido food for thought e que surjam ideias de todos para o futuro. Eu gostaria agora de pedir ao Sr. Secretário de Estado das Finanças, João Mendes, para fazer o fecho, umas palavras finais, a quem agradeço.
Muito boa tarde. Gostaria de agradecer, em nome do Ministério das Finanças, o convite para a participação à APFIPP, em especial no seu presidente, o Dr. João Pratas, para encerrar esta conferência. Sobre o futuro das pensões de reforma em Portugal, portanto, nós gostaríamos de sublinhar a importância de nós termos uma atividade dinâmica em termos económicos. O crescimento da economia portuguesa é fundamental para fazermos face a este desafio, e também é fundamental nós termos contas públicas sustentáveis. Eu não me debruçarei sobre matérias relacionadas com o sistema. Da parte do Governo temos sempre muito interesse em acompanhar estas matérias e saudamos o facto de terem convidado especialistas reputados internacionais para debater com os nossos especialistas, e temos também aqui o setor representado, o setor dos fundos de investimento, e isso é muito relevante fazer-se essa discussão. Portanto, eu sublinharia alguns aspectos que, do ponto de vista daquilo que é a nossa leitura da atividade económica, achamos que é importante tomar em consideração. Portanto, nós no ano 2022 crescemos 6,5%, devemos crescer 6,5%, e isso é sensivelmente o dobro daquilo que aconteceu, do que acontecerá ao nível europeu. Nós achamos que isso é muito significativo depois de termos tido o embate da pandemia que afetou muito o setor do turismo. Este ano estamos muito satisfeitos que o turismo já está a níveis superiores aos níveis da pré-pandemia. Temos crescido desde 2015 sucessivamente a nossa cota de mercado no mercado turístico. Ao nível do desemprego estamos em níveis historicamente baixos. Temos uma situação de pleno emprego em diversos setores de atividade. Isto não significa queira fazer uma leitura de que nós seremos imunes ao efeito do abrandamento económico que se prevê que antecipamos para o ano de 2023, mas julgamos que é importante sublinharmos estes aspectos positivos sobre a dinâmica da economia portuguesa, neste contexto em que da pandemia passámos para o desafio energético, a guerra na Ucrânia, que impõe todo um quadro de incerteza que se está a repercutir na economia mundial. E, naturalmente, temos um patamar de inflação que é muito elevado e que afeta um conjunto de rúbricas muito significativas no cabaz das famílias portuguesas. Sobre o desempenho das contas públicas, eu gostaria de sublinhar que isso é muito relevante para quem faz investimentos e está atento àquilo que é, digamos que, a credibilidade, o rating dos seus investimentos. Portugal não precisou em 2021, em 2022 e não vai precisar em 2023 daquilo que se chama, no quadro europeu, a cláusula de derrogação orçamental. No fundo, que é um pedido de exceção para se poder ter um déficit superior a 3%. Portugal não precisou disso em 2021, em 2022, em 2023, não precisará e, portanto, isso é excepcional se nós retirarmos as tabelas das projeções do outono da Comissão Europeia, nós vemos que Portugal, nestes países, faz parte do clube dos países que têm o melhor desempenho orçamental europeu e isso é algo de notável e que nós devemos sublinhar, porque, no fundo, toda esta matéria das pensões de reforma e o seu desafio está profundamente relacionado, se olharmos para as características do nosso sistema, com aquilo que é o desempenho das nossas contas públicas. Portanto, nós em 2022 e 2023 devemos ter dos melhores desempenhos orçamentais ao nível europeu. Como já disse, não precisamos da General Escape Clause. Nós, em 2023, devemos ter um rácio da dívida pública 24 pontos percentuais abaixo do seu pico que aconteceu em 2000, do seu pico e abaixo, inclusivamente, do nível de 2011. São 24 pontos percentuais. É absolutamente, creio eu, um desempenho à escala europeia notável e quando estamos a falar de reduzir tão significativamente a dívida, isso não pode deixar de ser tomado em consideração do ponto de vista da nossa trajetória quando fazemos o debate do futuro das pensões de reforma em Portugal. Sublinho que as testes de previsões mais recentes da Comissão Europeia dão que Portugal estará abaixo da dívida da Espanha e da França no final de 2023 e da Bélgica no final de 2024. Portanto, nós sairíamos do clube, digamos que dos países mais endividados, dos 3 mais endividados, e também tivemos notícias muito positivas ao nível dos ratings da República, que se transformam em crescimentos automáticos do rating, acréscimos do rating de um conjunto de bancos e de um conjunto de empresas de grande dimensão em Portugal que têm este rating. Portanto, a S&P, a DBRS e a Fitch subiram a notação de rating em Portugal este ano e a Moody's fê-lo no segundo semestre de 2021. E o que é, julgo de enfatizar, é que estas subidas de rating são feitas num quadro de incerteza extraordinária, ou seja, por regra, relativamente a países que têm os nossos próprios desafios, os níveis de endividamento que temos historicamente, aguarda-se sempre por períodos de acalmia para que estas mudanças de rating aconteçam. Ora, Portugal teve 4 subidas de rating seguidas e foram feitas com pandemia, foram feitas com crise da guerra na Ucrânia, foram feitas com a crise do crescimento dos preços da energia. E eu acho que este é um exemplo que é notável. Não significa que nós sejamos imunes, vamos ter os nossos desafios, temos que mostrar a nossa resistência, mas é uma leitura internacional que existe. Quando estivemos em Washington com todos os primary dealers da dívida portuguesa, eles incentivaram-nos a fazer mais roadshows para contarmos a história portuguesa com grandes empresas portuguesas a mais investidores que teriam menos conhecimento de como nós temos tido um desempenho distintivo, digamos que, no quadro europeu. Relativamente ainda, gostava de sublinhar também que o custo da dívida portuguesa está abaixo do custo das dívidas de Itália e de Espanha, quando olhamos para o mercado e mesmo no contexto que estamos a viver. Dizer que no mercado da dívida este ano conseguimos alongar as nossas maturidades, emitimos em média sensivelmente 11 anos, a maturidade média do estoque da dívida portuguesa anda na casa dos 7,4 anos, portanto nós estamos apostados em ter uma dimensão cada vez mais sustentável na gestão da nossa dívida. Sobre as questões da poupança, gostava de referir que o nosso empenho em matéria de oferecer oportunidades de poupança, nós temos os certificados de aforro e temos os certificados do Tesouro, que têm tido um crescimento significativo nos últimos meses. Portanto, em 2021, digamos que os certificados do Tesouro representam sensivelmente 11% da dívida direta do Estado e, em agosto, representavam um estoque de sensivelmente 32 mil milhões de euros, que é um valor cerca de 5% acima de 2021, e temos cerca de 600 mil aforradores em Portugal. Considerando os valores do último mês que temos disponível, que é outubro de 22, o estoque dos certificados aumentou mais de 600 milhões, são valores muito significativos, têm crescido desde agosto. Gostava também de sublinhar que relativamente o empenho do Governo relativamente ao designado PEP, que estava a ser debatido precisamente neste painel. Nós sabemos que é necessário fazer a clarificação do respectivo regime fiscal e, portanto, achamos que ele deve ter um regime que deve comparar com produtos de cariz similar, e temos também o regime legal no qual estamos a trabalhar ativamente neste momento para ter uma solução legal a muito curto prazo. Sabemos que é uma oportunidade também de oferecer standardização, de ter um selo europeu. Julgamos também uma oportunidade para o mercado, digamos que aproveitar esta chancela de standardização, de qualidade. Sabemos o quanto, e tem sido uma barreira que tem sido progressivamente derrubada, mas ainda existe alguma, por vezes, dificuldade em percepcionar produtos mais complexos. Portanto, há sempre este desafio de transformar coisas complexas em algo que seja simples e significativo para as pessoas apreender, em que, de facto, o nível de risco e aquilo que é o alcance temporal do seu objetivo de poupança são matérias absolutamente chave e que têm que ser apreendidas de uma forma simples pelas pessoas. Achamos que o PEP pode ser uma fórmula para chegar com essa credibilidade da simplicidade de um produto que oferece confiança e garantia às pessoas e que lhe permite complementar a sua pensão de reforma. Sublinhava ainda a iniciativa do Governo de aprovar o novo regime da gestão de ativos. Acho que é um aspecto importante a sublinhar, atento à audiência que nós temos, que visa melhorar a competitividade e a atratividade da atividade de gestão de organismos de investimento coletivo e dinamizar desta forma a alocação de poupança. Julgamos que este projeto prestará um maior alinhamento da nossa legislação com os estándares da União Europeia, assegurando maior proporcionalidade e equilíbrio regulatório, mantendo, contudo, elevados níveis de supervisão. Muito obrigado a todos.
Agradecemos então ao Sr. Secretário de Estado do Tesouro, Dr. João Nuno Mendes. Terminamos então esta conferência, Qual o Futuro das Pensões de Reforma em Portugal, onde estamos, para onde queremos ir. Relembramos também a colaboração da Aliança Global Investors, a Schroders, a Euronext e a Silvip. Em nome da APFIPP agradecemos a vossa presença. Boas festas e até uma próxima. Obrigado. Boa noite.